Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster, all the way down Whitehall and beyond. I'm Callum MacDonald. Hello. Also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Hello to you.
And Joe Tanner is a political strategist who advises politicians from, well, all political parties and none. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
And thank you for beaming in from Portugal. We'll catch up on that a little bit later on. We are going to focus today, of course, on the, well, global upheaval caused by Donald Trump, certainly provoked by Donald Trump, and try to work out exactly where things stand today. We're recording on Wednesday, the 5th of March. By the time you listen to this, it could all have changed, but what we'll try to do is put into context exactly what's happening and indeed what has happened since we last spoke. In a few moments, we will welcome to the podcast our guest for today, who is Mike Martin, who's the Liberal Democrat MP for Tunbridge Wells, also on the Defence Select Committee, also a senior visiting fellow in the War Studies Department at King's College London. Basically, what we're saying is he knows what he's talking about. Mike's coming up in a minute or two. Kirsty, I think we should just take this minute or two to consider exactly what has happened since we last spoke. And to name just a few things, there was the Oval Office bust-up between President Trump and indeed his sidekick, the Vice President J.D. Vance, and President Zelensky of Ukraine. That happened. Then there was the Trump withdrawal of aid to Ukraine. There was, of course, Sir Keir Starmer's summit last Sunday in London of European leaders, which may or may not have moved things forward. It's almost difficult to tell in the cloud of all that's going on. There have been huge shifts, basically, since we last spoke on the pod, Kirsty.
I have indeed. It's like news at warp speed, isn't it? And even if, like all of us, you follow it, if you don't follow it, quite closely every day, you're scrambling to keep up with it. It's been so fast moving. I do think, and I'm probably going to regret saying this, we're in a slight hiatus with it this evening. So hopefully this won't be out of date by the time it goes on, so that people can listen to it.
Jinxed us now.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Look, let's just take stock on where I think we have ended up after all of that shot of diplomacy and lack of diplomacy, etc., etc. I think where we've ended up is Trump has effectively strong-armed Zelensky into accepting what amounts to an extortionate business deal, where America gets 50% of any of those rare earth minerals extracted from Ukraine in return for, frankly, no greater security guarantee than US contractors being on the ground. The European Union, I think, after years of really equivocal, slow support for Ukraine, it's been giving Ukraine enough not to be defeated by the aggressor Russia, but not enough to win the war. I think it's finally woken up to the threat that military experts have been saying for years about we're moving into a much more dangerous world and we need to increase defence spending. And the irony that what's actually caused them to finally, shake out of their stupor is not Iran or Russia or China, but the democratically elected president of the United States. I think Starmer, as with Boris and Sunak, has followed on that tradition of remaining one of the staunchest allies that Ukraine has. And I think we should be proud of that, rightly proud of that. But I think whether Europe can get its act together in terms of filling the gap, the security gap left by America, remains to be seen. And I think if Trump is dangerously naive about Putin and his intentions and is effectively saying, look, I trust this guy. If I've got my guys on the ground drilling for minerals, he won't invade. I think if he's being dangerously naive, I think Starmer's decency, and I'm not knocking Starmer at all on this, he's by far and away had the greatest week that he's had since he's been elected, and he played an absolute blinder last week, and hats off to him. So I don't want to detract, I'm not being churlish about it, but I worry that his decency is potentially blinding him to the reality of what Trump is really all about now. And that despite his best endeavours, we're not going to get any further on that security guarantee. And we saw him getting blindsided over the US decision to cut military aid, for argument's sake, in the House of Commons. He told MPs when this was raised as a possibility, he said, I've been on the phone to him. I don't think that's going to happen. And half an hour later, we get a statement from the White House saying military aid has been cut. And I think that leaves us with some pretty difficult issues to contemplate. NATO, which has been the bedrock of the defending of our liberal democratic values for 80 years may very well be dead. I think it's clear that whether you flatter Trump or stand up to him, Trump will do what is right for Trump and America. And that raises questions about whether we can trust him. And that raises a question which is much more problematic than I think that we've woken up to yet. If we can't rely on him from a security point of view, can we trust him from a military security point of view? In other words, we are so intertwined with America. We share our intelligence with America. If his aims, his strategic aims are to realign with the likes of Putin, do we really want to be in a situation where we continue to share our intelligence with him? So there's some very big questions flowing out from this. But right where we are now, I think, is in a very uncomfortable and unhappy place.
And we will put these big questions to Mike in just a moment. Joe, a thought from you, I think, particularly on the political response. So Sir Keir Starmer had planned to have that leadership summit, the summit of leaders last Sunday. Obviously, it took on a whole new urgency given events of the kind of preceding 48 hours or so. Is there agreement, is there consensus, do you feel, in praise for Sir Keir Starmer's response to all of this?
I think there is, in the sense that well, I mean, it's exhausting, right? I can't get over what's happened in just a short number of days, because we sort of all got marched up that hill, watching Keir Starmer go out there, as Kirsty said, played a blinder with the letter from the King, etc. And then it just felt like everything was unraveling. It was like a sort of real plot twist in a film. But I think ultimately this feels like one of those, you make the best of a bad situation. You get dealt the cards. There's a lot of references to cards. We had that with Trump and Zelensky, but there's ultimately a series of things you try to do, and you're making the best of what you've got at any one time. And I think it's pretty impossible really to sort of pin any blame on Starmer, given that Trump is sort of changing the rules, changing the goalposts, rewriting the plan. He's basically, he'll tell someone one thing and then do something else. I'm not convinced even his advisors necessarily know what he's going to do from one day to the next. We've spent the last few weeks waking up wondering what the next thing from Trump's going to be that we haven't anticipated. So I think ultimately we're in relatively good shape, but the concern, as Kirsty said, is what exactly is the deal, and what is that going to do to that bit of Ukraine and this sort of financial barrel that then Zelensky's over. But we don't know. We're not privy to all the information. We're privy to what we've found out. I desperately hope there's more to it, and I hope that there is more that the US will do to sort of protect not only the people that they'll have on the ground, but also that their investment. But we just don't know at this stage.
Well, let's bring in Mike, who is our expert guest this week. Mike, welcome to the podcast. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for doing this. Let me start with the big one, I suppose. Based on your expertise, based on what you're seeing unfolding, are we on the road to peace in Ukraine? Is that what is unfolding before us, however chaotic and difficult it may seem?
I mean, it's impossible to say. I mean, I can't see a peace deal. The demands of Russia and what Ukraine/Europe, right? Ukraine and Europe are aligned, would accept, hasn't changed, right? What's changed is we've got Trump saying we're going to do a peace deal, but actually none of the fundamentals have changed. And, potentially there's a line, to be drawn, but Russia has, demands about Zelensky being replaced. Well, the Europeans are saying that Ukrainian sovereignty must be protected. Well, I mean, obviously, sovereignty means you choose your own leaders, so that sort of rules out Zelensky being replaced. Donald Trump, that was a slip of the tongue. Putin is under indictment for war crimes, as are lots of sort of senior officials in the Russian regime. I mean, they've kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children and taken them to Russia. Everyone's aware of what happened in Bucha. Like the idea that we're just going to ignore that, I don't think, our Prime Minister's a human rights lawyer, right? So he's well aware of all this stuff. And, he's already said that, for instance, the judgments against Hamas and, members of the Israeli cabinet should be upheld. So why should it be any different to, Vladimir Putin? So I do see a number of problems, and then we haven't even got into the sort of, okay, well, if there is a peace deal, then what does the enforcement of that peace deal look like? And I think, again, there are a bunch of really incompatible things. So the UK is really clear that they're not going to do that without a US security guarantee. And the US is really clear that they're not going to give a US security guarantee. And Ukraine's really clear that actually Minsk was a disaster for us. So we need a proper, Russia must be deterred. So what does that look like? The state of the British military, can we deploy and sustain significant numbers of troops to Ukraine? No. And in any case, if we're putting loads of European troops in Ukraine, does that then weaken other areas of the border with Russia, the flank with Russia, places like Estonia, Finland, this is not to say that I don't think that, in line with everyone else, that I think the Prime Minister's played the cards that, our cards as well as he can do. And I do understand this rhetoric around bridging between Europe and America because, well, that's basically what the Brits have done for, since the Second World War. But actually, I can't actually see what there is to bridge. And so I would argue that, with the Trump is incredibly unreliable. So even if he does say, "Oh, well, I'll do that," actually, do we really think that he will in the moment? I mean, that's a real problem. We got 1,000 British troops in Estonia, for example, and they're 30 miles from the Russian border. If the Russians come over that border, we're going there. Those British troops are under Estonian command, right? So we would go and deal with the Russians, and we'd be looking over our shoulder, going, "Are the Americans going to help us here?" So there's huge problems. I think, was it Joe or Kirsty said that, NATO might be dead. I think there's real concerns about that. And so I would argue the Lib Dems are arguing that actually we need to start thinking about potentially, with Trump being so unreliable, what does it look like working with our European allies in Europe to provide collective defense? And that's not to say that the best of all outcomes is America remaining engaged. So I do understand why the Prime Minister is doing what he's doing. But I just hope that below the line, inside the government departments, they are contingency planning for what it looks like if the US are not engaged.
I think your point on the bridge, this idea of Sir Keir Starmer, who, there is consensus about his approach being valiant and good and solid. But it was your thread on Twitter the other day that caught me about the fundamental difference in, I suppose, approaches that means that Starmer actually will not be able to be a bridge because of how the Europeans see Ukraine as a security threat, as a collective security threat, and how the US under Trump view Ukraine as a transaction. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so I mean, that's exactly it. The Europeans, of which I include the UK and the Ukrainians, see security in a collective sense. We all have the same adversary in Russia, and we understand very clearly that the defense of one is a defense of all, and the defense of all is the defense of one. And that's not how Trump sees Ukraine. Ukraine sees Trump as a transaction. They want to stop funding it, which is obviously fair enough. That's their position. And in any case, in that transaction, he favors Russia over Ukraine. Like, that's been really, really clear with the US positioning and statements and voting with Russia at the UN and all the rest of it. So it's not only that the Europeans and the US view the role of Ukraine in European security differently, it's also that we have really different views on the role of Russia and the threat that they pose. And so I find it hard to, with the best will in the world, and obviously I want the Prime Minister to succeed, I find it very hard to see how we can bridge those worldviews. And in any case, even if we could, he's so unreliable that we should really be making contingency plans.
Yeah. And that then comes to this idea of kind of thinking creatively and getting serious about defense and security. Now, there's a political point to be made here. This could have been done over the last 20 years and beyond to prepare for a crisis in a moment in time like this. However, it hasn't been, and so we find ourselves falling somewhat short. So how creatively can people think to fix this short or medium term?
Well, I'm a politician, so I'm going to make some political points now.
Quite right.
The 2.5 announcement is really, up from 2.3% of GDP. It is just kind of filling in a few of the very, very many gaps that we have in our forces, readiness, munitions, stockpiles, all the rest of it, right? And actually, to do credible defence of the Euro-Atlantic area with allies, and they would also need to increase their spending, we're looking at 3% as an absolute minimum, probably 3.5, right? So that 3.5 from where we are now is another sort of 25 to 30 billion pounds per year on defence. And that's about buying more capability. It's also about increasing the size of the army. It's about our munitions stockpiles, right? It's about the defence industrial base. The whole of our defence, from raw materials to factory to supply to capability to personnel, everything is salami sliced and stripped bare and not in a fit state. And I'm not sure the public is. I think it's really important that MPs lead on this and make sure the public are aware of just how poor a state our forces are in. So the Lib Dems have been arguing for a little while now that it's a 3% absolute minimum floor, and we've invited the government and the Conservatives to come together cross-party to look at how we do that, because it's a mixture of spending cuts, tax rises, and debt, right? If you look in Europe, they're looking to fund their defence expenditure through increased debt. Germany's looking at reforming its debt brake. The EU's changing the debt rules, all the rest of it. And if we come together with three parties, we remove the politicking out of it. It will obviously be a combination of all three. But if it does involve debt, then going to the bond markets, because that would mean, changing the fiscal rules. If we've got the three main parties in the UK going to the bond markets and agreeing, that makes it easier for the government to borrow that money at a lower rate of interest. And so that's our proposal, is that we actually sit down and talk about this. This is a national emergency and we need to get ahead of it. And the idea that you can spend 3% at some point in the next parliament is for the birds, with the current threat environment and the current state of our forces.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, to be fair, 2.5 was a bit kind of underplayed even before Trump went off the deep end last week. I think, is there a world though, even if we manage to expedite that increase to 3%, is there a world where it is genuinely possible for Europe to maintain a peacekeeping force in Ukraine without a meaningful US stock?
Well, I think other European powers are increasing defence spending. Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, was very impressive, and she's announced 3%. Poland is 4% plus. So there are other European states who are stepping up in spending terms. I think that I would, the Prime Minister said that this is going to come to Parliament, and in principle, I support the deployment of British forces in securing that peacekeeping deal. But there's a lot of detail there, and I would be, because of the enablers that America provides, I would be very, I'd have to look very, very carefully at the detail as to whether British forces should be there. If America, what America is saying about the guarantee, the backup, the enablers, the air power, all that kind of stuff. I think that we need to think very carefully about that, because one thing that we have learnt about Putin is that if you don't deter effectively, which is effectively what we have failed to do over the last 20 years, he will nibble and he will probe and he will test. And a bit like the example of the British forces in Estonia that I gave earlier, we don't want to put another piece of bait out, if you like, if it's not adequately acting as a deterrent. We should only put forces forward if they are adequately resourced, protected, have the alliance structures in place for them to act as a deterrent. Otherwise, they become a vulnerability.
Can I ask, Mike, the point you raise about the parties kind of getting together and having this conversation about what to do, how to increase spending, and also, I presume, they're therefore sort of agreeing a plan, whether it is debt, whether it is some agreement around where perhaps cuts might need to be made. Has that been just completely rejected? Is it something the Tories are up for? Where is the state of that conversation at? Is it just something you've been saying into a vacuum, or?
It's nothing heard from the government yet. So that's the proposal that's on the table.
And actually, given the sort of there are a lot of things at play here, because there's obviously all the talk about assets as well, and the Foreign Office have obviously always been concerned about, you know, unintended consequences of things, that when you take actions, they're always sort of, you know, I guess fairly risk averse out of all the departments, but also generally across government, like there has got to be some merit in looking at that coalition kind of effort, given
I could give a bit of, I can give a bit of detail on the assets as well, because I led a cross-party debate in House of Commons on seizing those assets. It was, in fact, it was the first debate of 2025, and we called on the government to go and figure out how to do it, because they've been saying, well, you know, and actually it was the Foreign Office wanted to do it, but the Treasury didn't want to do it. And we had a debate, and the motion was passed unanimously, instructing the government to go away and figure out how to do it in discussion with allies, right? Because the idea is that all of the G7 countries do it at the same time. Because one of the main drawbacks of that idea is if one country does it, then other people won't put their, you know, state assets in that country, because you'll get capital flights. If the UK did it, Saudi Arabia would no longer keep its central bank funds in the UK, because they'd be like, ooh. So the idea is all the G7 countries move at the same time. My sense is, and that was cross-party, and it was a long-term Lib Dem policy. The Conservatives shifted their position to be in favour, and then the government mood music changed significantly and became much warmer towards it at about that time at the beginning of the year. And you'll have seen probably recently it's come around again, and again the mood music is warm. My sense is that those discussions have been had, but they don't want to. You can only do it once, and you can't come back from it. And I think it's in the mix of all of the negotiations that are going on at the moment. It's clearly a stick. There's $300 billion of frozen Russian state assets, and quite what role they play in the mix of the peace deal. And there'll always be that, you know, if the peace deal's off, then we'll take them and give them to Ukraine, but it's not quite sure. So I think the government has progressed significantly in talking to allies about this, and the position of France and Germany has softened and shifted. And then Belgium is the key country, because $200 billion of the assets are in Brussels in Euroclear. So my sense is that there is movement on it.
And can I just say that, so the challenge for the Lib Dems is obviously, like, the Lib Dems have been very focused on things like care, the fact that, you know, the care system has been such a mess and that there hasn't been a real plan around that. So you've already, as a party, been really focused on key areas of government spending that it's been felt have been neglected anyway. And so there's a challenge for you guys, I guess, in terms of the priorities and how much focus you can put on where money should be spent and when, which is going to, you know, be potentially uncomfortable for the party in terms of, you know, having to set priorities in, you know, real time.
Hey, you know, I might surprise you here. If you look back at our manifesto in 2024, we were the only party out of the three main parties to argue for an increased size of the army, and that was costed. So to increase the army by 10,000 with a pathway to 100,000. And we set out our plans for 2.5 that were fully costed with a tax rise on digital firms, so on Twitter and Meta, and selling their services into our market. Actually, you know, being the third party, you naturally get less airtime, but actually I think we're pretty solid on that defence stuff. I certainly am very comfortable, as Callum noted. I've sort of been knocking around in this area for 20 years, and I'm very comfortable with where the Lib Dems are on defence.
Can I ask a time frame question? Because all of this, apart from costing an inordinate amount of money, seems like it will take a very long time. If Trump continues to potentially push up inflation in America with his, you know, tariffs on allies, we've got midterms coming in 2026. Is there and then presumably some of the worst excesses of Trump might get curtailed if he loses one or both the houses in the midterm. It's almost like what is most likely to happen first, if you like, to be sort of sit down, play for time, and wait for politics of America to become a little easier, or, you know, do we push ahead? And realistically, even if we had all guns blazing, 3%, somehow or other we managed to convince Gen Z to sign up to join the army, and we pushed our army strength up, etc., etc., realistic time frame are we talking about to be the cavalry for Ukraine in the absence of the United States?
So no matter what we spend on defense and no matter how well it goes, we need to play for time anyway, right? The analogy that's used is often the 1930s, and the question is, which year are we in the 1930s? Are we 1934, where we decided to rearm, or are we 1938, where Chamberlain went to Munich, and one interpretation of what he did in Munich was buy us 18 months, where we put defense spending at 7% of GDP to really put the pedal to the floor. I think the reality is that we've got no idea what Trump's going to veer and haul, and the Supreme Court as well is sort of busy slapping down his. You probably saw recently came and said actually we should be spending all that aid money. Congress has already appropriated it, so it should be spent. So who knows? It's just that in the military realm, he is the commander in chief, so he has a degree of latitude about the military response that America makes, and particularly when it comes to like the Article 5 guarantee. If the Brits are going, right, we're calling Article 5, and the Americans, Trump is going, well, I'm not so sure. That is his sole purview to do that. So we should, of course, be preparing as quickly as we possibly can, and we should also be delaying we want to keep the Americans on board for as long as we can as well. I think, to answer your question very directly about deployment of forces to Ukraine, our army is has about 68,000 people in it.
68, yeah. But you'll know from all surveys that Gen Z would rather, shoot their own foot off than join the army and fight for
Yeah,
their
I'm not
country.
sure. I don't actually. I'm not sure about that. And the reason I'm not sure about that is because it's quite interesting. When I was in the army, I joined because I knew I was going to Afghanistan, because I wanted to go to Afghanistan, and the army was like fully recruited, bursting at the seams, because people wanted to do that. They wanted to have purpose and do something and be guided. And at the moment, defense is quite underfunded, training opportunities are difficult. Like, what is the purpose of the army? And so there are very few deployments. So actually, if you had a long-term role in somewhere like Ukraine, actually what you would probably find is that recruitment would go up, because people would suddenly be like, oh, that'd be interesting. I'd quite like to do that. And, I think this sort of every generation does it, don't they? They say the young of these days are not like the young when we were young. And I think that people are people. And if you define the narrative well enough and you outline the purpose, then I think people step up to that.
Can I ask you one really out there question? And I'm sure you're going to go, oh my gosh, no, that's far too escalatory in the current circumstances. Look, when the Soviet Union broke up, in 1994, Ukraine still had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And I hear quite a lot of Ukrainians these days go, well, hold on a minute. We gave all that up under the Budapest Memorandum because United States, Russia, France, Britain would guarantee our safety. Well, that is obviously quite not literally worth the paper that it's written on now. Why shouldn't Ukraine arm themselves from a nuclear standpoint now as the best deterrent and the quickest deterrent?
Because Ukraine is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if they were to acquire nuclear weapons, they would be breaking that treaty and then would be treated like Iran is treated. And I don't think the allies of Ukraine, ourselves included, would be supportive of Ukraine developing nuclear weapons.
Sure. Ukraine would argue that the international rules-based order of things is very rapidly breaking down under Donald Trump, so why not get ahead of it?
Look, I think the thing about nuclear weapons is you have them because you don't want to use them. That's why you have them. Ultimately, because of mutually assured destruction, the idea of nuclear weapons is you maintain a strategic balance of deterrence. I don't think Ukraine developing nuclear weapons during a war, an occupation by a nuclear power, I don't think that would increase strategic deterrence. I think it would make the situation much more dangerous.
I agree. I just thought I'd be good to put that in there.
But it's a thought provoker, isn't it? It is. And it's trying to map out the way forward. Even as we speak, the defense secretary's in Washington to speak to his US counterpart and to try to work on the parameters of a European peace plan for Ukraine. So there's movement all the time. And so, Mike, thank you for helping us take stock of where things are at right now. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thanks,
Bye.
mate.
Lovely to have Mike Martin with us. He really is an expert in his field, and actually I think a real encouragement, if I can say this, to have somebody with his expertise in the House of Commons on the Defence Select Committee, obviously still representing his constituency as well. But Joe, he's got quite a remarkable brain. I mean, the themes that are emerging here, even he is questioning whether the future of NATO is going to hold up in all of this, and actually whether, and this is what the Lib Dems are pushing for, as he was saying, there needs to be a kind of rethinking of the UK and European allies and trying to work out something of a new relationship there in case this is the point at which NATO totally crumbles.
Yeah, and I thought as well his point about the Lib Dems trying to push for this kind of coalition discussion around what to do because the numbers are huge, the UK's financial position is grim, and this idea of sort of taking the politics out, which if I was Keir Starmer, I think, actually, why would you not jump at that? Because realistically, he's still going to be the one who's fronting it all up. But actually taking out the politics of being able to essentially neutralise the debate around some of the areas where there are going to have to be cuts. It just feels that's, there is definitely some merit in that. But, what a time to be an MP for Mike Martin as well, with his background, his knowledge. You can just picture him kind of chewing down his fingernails as he's sort of hearing Trump rewrite history, and he's obviously a huge expert and also has served himself. So I still just can't get over what an extraordinary week we've already seen, and it just feels like every morning, what's next? What are the government going to do? What curveball has come overnight? It's just quite an astonishing time, really, for our politicians and for a new government, which, they're still relatively new, let's face it.
And there is, Kirsty, there is a what is the government going to do? I make reference to the point that the Defence Secretary is currently in Washington, so this thing edges along, but it's about wiggle room. It's one of the most telling comments, perhaps, and I think you picked up on this as well, with Mike was the Foreign Office wanted to do something, and the Treasury said, "Nope, you can't do that." And you said, "Shocker!" At that point. That is the kind of rhythm of life, and that is potentially telling even in this international crisis situation.
Yeah, look, I mean, Starmer might come to find out much the same as Boris did before him and Blair before that international crisis may consume your premiership, but ultimately they don't have much of an impact on the ballot box when it comes to a general election. And what will really determine your fortunes is whether people feel better off after 5 years of a Labour government or not. Now, you can make all the special pleading that you like about, black swan events, and they seem to come along with alarming regularity these days. But nevertheless, that is the central test and will always remain so. And this is why this issue is particularly difficult. Look, Mike's 100% right. 2.5% is not nearly enough. It wasn't enough before Trump took his toys and decided he wasn't going to play anymore. 3% is a basic kind of floor. That is a huge amount of money, and it really needs to be expedited. We have, I think, heard this week as well that Rachel Reeves again is minded not to play with the fiscal rules because we are so burdened by debt and the cost of servicing our debt that anything that spooks the gilt markets right now is short-term gain for long-term pain. So that leaves us with tax rises. That would be, I think, terminal right now. After saying, a matter of a few months ago, that's it. This was a one-off to plug this extraordinary £22 billion black hole. If people can't see me, I'm doing air quotes right now. And so that leaves us with austerity 2.0. And actually, what we're looking at now is potentially much tougher cuts to be able to give her and the Treasury and Defence some more wiggle room, because we might need to be picking up much more of a bill for defending Europe than hitherto we had been budgeting and expecting for. So, where do you get that? Well, the common thread at the moment seems to be around the benefits bill, which, pre-sickness COVID benefits were at 67 billion, which in itself is an eye-popping amount of money, but it's predicted to rise to 100 billion in the next 5 years. So there are no easy answers, particularly for a Labour government, in going after that. The NHS is not an easy place, but potentially ripe for at least productivity gain reform. And the other is the size of the civil service itself. Now, I'm sure I've banged on about this before on the pod, but 2016, before Brexit, the size of the civil service was 384,000. It's now at 542,000. I got my calculator out. That's something like a 40% plus increase in 10 years. And I'm sure we don't all go, do you know what? I feel 40% more, efficient civil service coming at me. And if I could just throw another problem into the mix, at the back end of last year, you will recall that the public sector pay review body recommended a pay rise for this year of 2.8%. At the time that made that recommendation, that was 0.2% of what inflation stood at the time, and yet every single public sector union went, no, this is a disgrace, up with this, we will not put. Well, inflation is set to rise to 3.7 by about autumn of this year, so we're now looking at a below inflation pay rise for the public sector. So I predict that we might very well have a problem of additional strikes on our hands this year as well, all of which again drains the public purse enormously and costs a huge amount of money. So no easy answers, A, on how we move forward on protecting Ukraine, B, what we do in a new world order where Trump is prepared to realign with the Soviet, with Putin and Russia, and Europe can take care of itself, and see how we're going to get ourselves out of the enormous, fiscal hole that we are in.
Joe, do you think that you can sell that? Are any of these things politically palatable?
Go on, Joe, give us a spin.
I say that. Oh my gosh, come on. I mean, it is astonishing that we're talking. That's why I think this Lib Dem sort of, let's get everyone to sort of try and come up with some agreement on some areas, is just, for me, feels politically safer for the government, because ultimately, as Kirsty quite rightly pointed out, all of the problems, whether it was COVID, whether it was Ukraine, energy prices, it didn't help the Tories as a defence whatsoever. It didn't help at all. And I just think that, therefore, you've got to be thinking ahead around how do you get yourself re-elected in a few years' time, when there are going to be plenty of things they promised that we never thought they were going to be able to do, but there are also going to be some things that are potentially going to get worse. I mean, Kirsty, you're right. You talk about NHS productivity, but a lot of that is actually about spending money first to change the way certain things are done, to then improve things. So it isn't as if there's a big saving. That is a longer term operation that then will get you some benefits further down the line. It isn't something you can, snap your fingers, it's going to happen soon. So I think that's where I think that, it would be very difficult in an election in a few years' time for the Tories or for the Lib Dems to say, but you did this, you did that, when actually some of this stuff could be part of a bigger conversation because it is in the national interest to do so. So, I don't find myself agreeing with the Lib Dems much. I was very keen on their focus on care during the last election. I thought Ed Davey was a bit too frivolous with the stunts. But I actually think this is an area where they might be onto something. And I think politically it would make a lot of sense for the government to look seriously at having a bigger conversation.
Guys, thank you both so much, and our thanks again to Mike Martin for joining us. As you're listening, if you would like to respond and add your comments, we would be glad to receive them. You can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Whitehall, or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com. We love to get your messages, and we'll read them on next week's episode. Similarly, if you've got questions or comments or analysis of your own to offer, then ping it on over, and we look forward to receiving it. For now, Kirsty and Joe, thank you. The Whitehall Sources podcast drops into your feed every single week, bringing you inside politics at Westminster and beyond. There is so much happening. You do not need to be anywhere else. We'll keep you right up to date with the best experts and best expertise. Make sure you subscribe, follow this podcast, and we'll talk to you again next week.